Liam Hawthorne sat at the edge of his bed, his bare feet resting against the cold marble floor. The dim glow of his bedside lamp cast long shadows across the room, stretching up the sleek black walls, reflecting off the shelves, lined with leather-bound books and priceless artifacts. His silver wristwatch ticked softly in the quiet, marking each passing second like a heartbeat in the dark. Midnight. Right on schedule. He let out a breath and leaned back, his fingers grazing the edge of the thick folder lying open beside him. Pages of classified documents spilled onto the bedspread, maps, schematics, and grainy surveillance photos, each marked with a bold red confidential stamp. The final piece of the puzzle was here, and the weight of what it meant pressed heavy on his chest. And then, it happened. A soft creak. The door. Liam's gaze snapped toward the entrance of his room, every nerve in his body instantly on edge. The door had opened just an inch, a thin line of dim hallway light slicing through the darkness. It was almost imperceptible, a movement so slight it could have been the wind, or so he might have thought if the air conditioning hadn't been turned off for the night. Then came the sound. A hesitant shuffle, the barely audible intake of breath. Someone was there, watching. Before he could react, the door swung open wider, revealing a petite silhouette standing frozen in the doorway. The glow from the hall outlined her slender frame, casting her in an almost ghostly light. It was her, Claire Belmont, his live-in maid. Her wide green eyes locked onto him, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Liam could see it, the sharp intake of her breath, the way her lips parted, as if to form words that never came. She had expected an empty room, a peaceful silence, but instead, she had walked straight into something else entirely, something she wasn't supposed to see. Her gaze flicked downward, to the bed, where the scattered documents lay in disarray, to the glint of polished metal peeking from beneath, the pillow, to him, sitting there, shirtless, his expression unreadable, shock, confusion, fear. It all flickered across her face in an instant before she took a staggering step back. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Too late. Liam was already up. In one swift motion, he was on his feet, closing the distance between them before she could retreat fully into the hall. His hand came up, catching the door before she could slam it shut, trapping her in place. Claire. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was something in it that made her freeze. What are you doing here? I thought you were asleep, she stammered, her fingers clutching the hem of her uniform tightly. I heard something, a noise. Then came another sound, a hesitant shuffle, barely audible, like the lightest step of someone who didn't want to be heard. Liam's muscles tensed, his senses sharpening instantly. He had trained himself to recognize patterns, to dissect the weight and rhythm of footsteps, and these weren't the heavy, assured strides of an intruder, nor the clumsy ones of someone lost. No, these were careful, reluctant steps, as if the person behind them had only just realized the mistake they'd made. His mind raced, analyzing every possibility within seconds. An assassin? Unlikely. Any professional would have moved faster, struck without hesitation. A thief? No, his security was impenetrable. That left only one possibility, someone who was here by accident. But even as the logic settled, Liam didn't let his guard drop. He moved without sound, his body trained for efficiency, reaching for the firearm hidden in the bedside drawer. The cool metal met his palm, but he didn't draw it yet. Instead, he waited, eyes locked on the sliver of the opening door. And then, a whisper, a soft, breathless voice. Mr. Hawthorne. The sound sent a ripple through the tension in the room. It wasn't the voice of a threat. It was familiar, uncertain, even nervous. His grip on the gun loosened slightly as he placed the voice at last. Elena Vasquez. The maid. His maid. A flicker of surprise crossed Liam's face, though he masked it just as quickly. Of all the people who could have intruded on this moment, she was the last one he expected. He should have relaxed, should have dismissed her presence as an accident, an honest mistake. But something about this didn't sit right. Elena wasn't careless. She was meticulous, precise, always moving with a quiet grace that came from years of discipline. She wasn't the type to barge into his room in the middle of the night, not when she had worked for him long enough to know his rules, his boundaries. So why was she here? Liam didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, watching her silhouette hesitate in the doorway. The dim light from the hallway barely illuminated her form, but he could make out the loose strands of dark hair framing her face, the soft rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed unevenly. She was nervous. Good. It meant she realized her mistake. Still, he needed to know more. "Eleanor," he finally spoke, his voice measured, low. "What are you doing here?" A pause. Then, a sharp inhale, as if she had been holding her breath. I didn't mean to. I was cleaning the hallway, and the door, your door, it wasn't fully shut. I thought maybe something was wrong." Liam's eyes narrowed slightly. His door wasn't fully shut. That was impossible. He was meticulous about locking it every night, and yet, there she stood. He didn't respond right away, letting the weight of the moment settle over them both. He studied her posture, the slight tremble in her fingers where she clutched the edge of her uniform. She was telling the truth, or at least part of it. "Elena," he said again, slower this time. "What did you see?" She stiffened. That reaction told him everything. Her gaze flickered past him, just for a fraction of a second, toward the bed, toward the documents that lay sprawled out across the sheets. He didn't have to turn around to know what she was looking at. Damn it! Liam's mind calculated the risks in an instant. Those documents weren't just sensitive, they were dangerous. If the wrong people got their hands on them, lives would be at stake. His mission would be compromised. And now, standing right in front of him, was a civilian who had just stumbled upon something she was never meant to see. His fingers twitched toward the gun again. "Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping lower, more controlled. "I'll ask you one more time. What did you see?" She swallowed, her throat working as she struggled to find words. And then she did something unexpected. She stepped forward. Liam almost moved, almost reached for his weapon, but he held himself back at the last second, watching as she entered the room fully and slowly pushed the door shut behind her. Click. It was a deliberate sound, a choice. She wasn't backing away. She wasn't running. She was staying. That alone sent his mind spiraling into new calculations. If she had been scared, if she had truly just made a mistake, she would have apologized, turned on her heel, and left as quickly as possible. But instead, she was facing him. That meant something, and he needed to know what. "Elena," he said, keeping his voice level but firm. "You shouldn't be here." She hesitated, but then her jaw tightened slightly. Neither should those. Her gaze flicked toward the documents again. Bold. Too bold. Liam's patience thinned just slightly. He had spent years perfecting the art of control, keeping emotions at bay, ensuring that every move he made was calculated, precise. But this was unexpected. He took a step forward. So did she. The air between them thickened, charged with something neither of them could quite name. "Eleanor," he murmured, softer this time, but no less intense. "You don't want to get involved in this." She exhaled shakily, her fingers curling at her sides. "I think I already am." For the first time in a long while, Liam felt something close to genuine surprise. He studied her carefully, the way her eyes darted between him and the evidence of whatever classified operation he was entangled in, the way her breath hitched slightly, as if she was fighting herself, warring between instinct and logic. She was terrified. But she wasn't running. Liam could respect that, but it also meant she had just become a liability. And liabilities were dangerous. "Elena," he said one last time, softer now, almost a whisper. "You need to leave. Right now." Her lips parted, but no words came, because she knew. Leaving wouldn't change what she had seen. And now they both had a problem, one that neither of them knew how to solve. Yet Elena knew she should have turned around, apologized, pretended she had seen nothing. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But her feet remained planted where they were, her pulse hammering in her throat as she stared at Liam. She had known her employer was a man of secrecy, that there was something about him lurking beneath the surface, something sharp, something controlled. But this was different. The cold, assessing look in his eyes, the way his muscles were coiled as if ready to strike, the almost imperceptible flick of his fingers toward the drawer. She wasn't naive. She knew what was kept in bedside drawers of men like him. Liam, Hawthorne was dangerous, and she had just walked straight into the lion's den. Elena swallowed, forcing herself to steady her breathing. The air in the room was heavy, thick with tension, pressing in from all sides. If she made the wrong move, said the wrong thing, she wasn't sure she'd be leaving this room at all. She wet her lips. "I didn't mean to see anything," she murmured, forcing herself to sound more composed than she felt. She hesitated, eyes flicking to the stack of papers again. They were strewn across the bed haphazardly, pages covered in symbols, codes, and something that looked like coordinates. Some of them were marked with red ink, hastily scrawled notes in the margins, and beneath them, partially covered, was something far more chilling. A photograph, a grainy, black and white image of a man lying face down in what looked like an alley, blood pooling beneath his head. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Liam saw the way her pupils dilated, the minute stiffening of her spine, and he knew she had seen too much. A quiet curse slipped from his lips, though his expression remained unreadable. "You need to forget what you saw," he said, voice smooth, controlled. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. Elena looked back at him, heart pounding. Forget? How could she forget this? Whatever was happening here, whatever Liam was involved in, wasn't just business. It was life and death, and she had just walked into the middle of it. She forced herself to swallow the fear curling in her stomach. If she let it show, if she let him see just how shaken she was, he'd know he had complete control over the situation. And she couldn't afford that. "I don't even know what I saw," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Just some papers, some research." Liam's lips curled slightly, but there was no humor in it. "Don't play games with me, Elena." She flinched at the way he said her name. Low, measured, weighted with meaning. A warning. But she was in too deep now. There was no pretending her way out of this. Slowly, carefully, she straightened her spine. If I was going to scream or run, I would have done it already. Liam studied her. His dark eyes traced the angles of her face, searching, calculating, looking for signs of weakness, of deception. "You don't understand what you've walked into," he said finally. "Then make me understand," she countered, surprising even herself with the steadiness of her voice. His gaze flickered. Amusement, annoyance, it was hard to tell. "I don't owe you an explanation," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I think you know that if you don't give me one, I'll start asking the wrong people the wrong questions." The shift in the air was instant. Liam's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Something that made Elena's stomach clench. She had just stepped onto thin ice, and she knew it. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You're either brave," he murmured, or very, very stupid. Elena's fingers curled into fists at her sides. I just don't like being treated like I don't have a choice. Liam let out a quiet laugh, though there was no warmth in it. You don't. A chill ran down her spine. She opened her mouth. To say what? She wasn't sure. But before she could, Liam moved. It was subtle, fluid, but she felt it like a shift in gravity. He took a slow step forward, erasing what little distance was left between them. She had to tilt her chin up to meet his gaze now, his presence consuming, suffocating. I'll give you one chance, he murmured. One chance to turn around, walk out of here and forget every single thing you saw tonight. Eleanor's breath caught. She wasn't an idiot. She knew what he was offering her. A way out, a chance to pretend none of this had ever happened, to go back to the safety of ignorance. But some part of her, some stubborn, reckless part, knew she couldn't take it, because she had already seen too much. And so, instead of stepping back, instead of averting her gaze, she held her ground. Liam saw it, and he knew. With a quiet sigh, he reached up, running a hand through his hair in something almost like frustration. Then, after a long pause, he muttered under his breath, "You're a damn problem, Elena." Her pulse jumped. Liam exhaled sharply. "Fine." His voice was crisp, sharp. "You want to know what you've gotten yourself into?" He took another step forward. And this time, Eleanor did take a step back, her back hitting the door. Liam leaned in just slightly, his voice dropping lower. "Then you'd better be prepared to deal with the consequences." And just like that, the choice was no longer hers to make. Elena's breath was shallow, every muscle in her body coiled tight as if bracing for a blow that had yet to come. She could feel the solid weight of the door pressing against her back, the cold brass of the doorknob grazing her fingers. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to reach for the handle, twist, and disappear into the darkened halls of the estate before Liam could stop her. But she didn't move. Couldn't, because something in his gaze told her it wouldn't matter. Liam Hawthorne wasn't the kind of man who let things slip through his fingers. She could see it in the way he held himself, the quiet but absolute command in his posture, the deadly precision in his every movement. A man like that didn't make idle threats. And right now, she was standing at the edge of something vast, something irreversible. "Tell me," she whispered, barely recognizing her own voice. It was too steady, too sure, when inside she felt anything but. Liam arched a brow, his expression unreadable. "Tell you what exactly?" Eleanor licked her lips, suddenly acutely aware of how dry her throat had become. "The truth. All of it." His gaze darkened. For a moment she thought he might laugh, might dismiss her with a smirk and a cutting remark. But instead, he did something far worse. He stepped back. It was subtle, a mere shift in weight, but the absence of his nearness left a coldness in the space between them. She hadn't realized how much his presence had dominated the room until he withdrew even slightly. And yet, despite the new sliver of distance, he still commanded every ounce of her attention. "You think you want the truth?" he said, almost conversationally. "Fine." He turned then, moving away from her, towards the bed where the papers lay scattered. The photograph, that photograph, caught the dim glow of the bedside lamp, the stark contrast of black and white, more ominous than it had any right to be. Elena's pulse quickened as Liam reached for it, lifting the image between his fingers, holding it up as if appraising it for the first time. "This man," he said, tapping a finger against the photo's surface, "was dead before the police even got the call, before the body was found, before the city even realized something had gone terribly wrong." Eleanor swallowed hard, not trusting herself to speak. Liam's lips curved slightly, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Because I made it happen." The air rushed from her lungs. He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, that for a moment her brain struggled to process it. Her heart pounded against her ribs, the weight of his words settling over her like a lead blanket. You killed him." Liam hummed, neither confirming nor denying. He was watching her closely, gauging her reaction. Waiting. Elena's mind reeled. She had suspected. Of course she had. The moment she saw the photograph, the moment she laid eyes on the coded documents, she had known Liam was involved in something illegal. But knowing in theory and hearing it confirmed in the cool, measured cadence of his voice were two very different things. The rational part of her screamed at her to run, to get as far away from this man as possible. And yet, another part, one she didn't fully understand, kept her feet rooted in place. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Liam tilted his head, considering her. "Because you asked." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, a flicker of amusement dancing across his expression. "But it's the only one you're getting." Eleanor's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "What happens now?" Liam sighed, setting the photograph down with careful precision. "That depends on you." She stiffened. "Meaning?" He turned to face her fully, expression unreadable once more. "You have two choices, Elena." She didn't like where this was going. Liam took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them once more. This time, she refused to move back, refused to let him see the way her body tensed at his proximity. "One," he murmured, "you walk out of this room and pretend none of this ever happened. You forget what you saw. You go back to your life. And you never ask questions again." Her heart pounded. "And the other?" Liam's eyes darkened, his voice dropping into something almost dangerous. "You stay. And you learn." Eleanor's breath hitched. He wasn't just talking about answers anymore. He was offering her something more. Something far more dangerous than knowledge. A way into his world. She didn't respond immediately, and Liam took that silence as permission to push just a little further. He lifted a hand, slow, deliberate, and traced a single finger down the curve of her jaw. The touch was feather-light, almost non-existent, but it sent a shiver racing through her spine. "This isn't a game, Elena," he murmured. "If you choose to stay, there's no going back." She swallowed hard. There was a time, just minutes ago, when she would have laughed at the idea. Stay? Stay and what? Become some kind of accomplice? But as she stood there, feeling the weight of his gaze, the certainty in his presence, she realized she had already crossed the line. She had stepped into the darkness the moment she walked through that door. And there was no turning back now. The only question that remained was, did she have the courage to admit it? Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken meaning. Finally, she drew in a shaky breath. "I'm not afraid of the truth." Liam studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, purposefully, he smiled. "Good," he murmured. Because the truth was about to consume her whole. Liam's smile lingered for only a second before it faded, replaced by something far more calculating. The air between them had thickened, charged with something unspoken, but undeniable. Elena could feel her pulse thrumming in her throat, a relentless rhythm against the backdrop of eerie silence that had settled over the room. She should have been terrified. She was terrified, but not in the way she expected. Fear had a way of sharpening the senses, of making every detail more vivid. She could see the way the dim light cast sharp angles across Liam's face. The way his gaze never wavered, as if he were studying her reactions as much as she was studying his. He was a man who lived in the shadows, who dealt in secrets and silence, and she had just willingly stepped into his world. The question was, had she made a mistake? Liam moved then, his footsteps barely making a sound against the thick rug as he circled back toward the bedside table. His fingers traced the edge of the scattered documents, his expression unreadable. It was unnerving the way he seemed so at ease despite what he had just admitted. "How long have you been working here, Elena?" His voice was deceptively casual, but she wasn't fooled. She swallowed. Almost a year, he hummed softly, as if turning that information over in his mind. And in all that time, you never once questioned what kind of man I was. She hesitated. What was the right answer here? Lying seemed pointless, but the truth might be dangerous. Liam lifted a brow, as if reading her thoughts. Be honest. Elena took a breath. I always knew there was something different about you. She forced herself to hold his gaze. You're careful. Too careful. And powerful men don't get that way by playing fair. His lips twitched slightly. Smart girl. The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't condescending. It was assessing. He reached for one of the documents, lifting it between his fingers before turning it toward her. It was filled with numbers, codes, things she didn't fully understand at a glance. But what caught her attention wasn't the content. It was the red mark in the corner, a symbol she had seen before. Her stomach clenched. Liam watched her reaction closely. Recognize it. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Yes, it had been a fleeting moment, months ago. She had been dusting in his study, when she caught sight of a similar mark on a folder tucked away in his desk. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it, just a strange insignia, nothing more. But now, staring at it under vastly different circumstances, her mind connected the dots. This wasn't just some organization. This was something much bigger. Liam leaned in slightly, his presence an unshakable force. Do you know what it means? Eleanor's mouth was dry. No. He studied her for a long moment, then exhaled. Then let me enlighten you. He stepped away, pacing toward the small bar cart in the corner of the room. The sound of glass clinking filled the silence as he poured a drink, the rich amber liquid catching the dim light. He took a slow sip before turning back to her. That symbol represents a very specific group of people, he said, his voice smooth but edged with something dangerous. A group that operates beneath the surface of society, pulling the strings, in ways most people will never realize. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Like a secret society? Liam smirked. You could call it that. But it's not some old boys' club playing politics for fun. This is something far more intricate. She licked her lips, trying to steady her breathing. And you're part of it. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another sip of his drink before placing the glass down with deliberate care. Then, finally, he said, I am it. The weight of his words settled over her like a vice. Liam Hawthorne wasn't just involved. He was at the center of it. Her mind raced. This wasn't just a crime syndicate or a wealthy elite pulling strings from behind closed doors. This was something deeper, something woven into the very fabric of power itself. And somehow, she had stumbled right into it. I should leave, she whispered. But even as she said it, she didn't move. Liam's eyes gleamed. But you won't. She hated that he was right. Why me? The words slipped out before she could stop them. Liam's expression shifted slightly, just enough for her to see that he wasn't unaffected by the question. Because, he said, his voice lower now, I see things in people. Strength. Potential. He took another step closer. And this time, she didn't back away. And you, Elena, you're not as innocent as you pretend to be. Her breath hitched. It wasn't a threat. It was an observation. A truth she hadn't even fully admitted to herself, because deep down, in the space between fear and fascination, she knew he was right. Something inside her wanted to know, wanted to understand the world Liam existed in, to see what lay beyond the carefully constructed facades of high society. And that, more than anything, was what truly terrified her. Liam must have sensed it, because his smirk deepened. You're already in, Elena. Whether you realize it or not, she clenched her fists. And if I walk away? Liam tilted his head, considering. Then you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering when the past will catch up to you. A shiver ran through her. And if I stay? His gaze darkened, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. Then you'll learn what it means to survive in my world. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the weight of her decision loomed over her. Every logical part of her screamed at her to leave, to forget what she had seen and never look back. But logic had stopped mattering the moment she stepped through that door, because Liam was right, she was already in, and there was no going back. A long silence stretched between them before Elena finally lifted her chin, forcing herself to breathe past the tightness in her chest. "Teach me," she said. Liam studied her, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted. Something raw, something almost approving. His lips curved ever so slightly. "Welcome to the real world, Elena." And just like that, the game had truly begun. Elena's heartbeat hammered in her chest, a frantic rhythm she couldn't shake, even as she stood there, watching Liam closely, trying to make sense of the new reality she had just stepped into. The room, once familiar, had become something else entirely, as though it had shifted into another dimension. The shadows seemed darker now, the air thicker, more suffocating. There was no escaping this, no turning back. Liam Hawthorne had just drawn her into a world that wasn't hers, and the coldness in his eyes told her exactly what that meant. "Sit," he commanded, his voice smooth yet heavy, and though it wasn't, a request. There was something about the way he said it that made it feel like a choice, a dark, inevitable choice. Elena didn't move for a moment. Her mind was racing, trying to process everything. She was standing on the edge of something monstrous, and her guts screamed at her to turn around, to walk out the door and never look back. But it was already too late. Her body betrayed her as she lowered herself into the chair he gestured to, the leather creaking under her weight. Liam's eyes followed her every move, his gaze never faltering. He crossed the room slowly, his steps deliberate, his presence suffocating. Elena's palms were damp as she clenched her fists in her lap, trying to steady herself. She couldn't look away from him, not even as he leaned against the wall, arms folded over his chest, exuding the calm, calculated power that made him so dangerous. "You've seen a glimpse of my world, Elena," he said quietly, his tone deceptively soft, almost friendly. But she knew better. "But I don't think you understand what it really means. It's not just power. It's not just money. It's control. It's manipulation. It's a game where the rules are only ever known to those who play it." Elena swallowed hard. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and she couldn't help but feel like a pawn in a game she didn't understand. She had stepped into something far darker than she had ever imagined. "I didn't ask for this," she finally said, her voice low, betraying her unease. Liam chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth, cold and knowing. "None of us ask for it, Elena. But life doesn't always give us choices. Sometimes it just hands us a path and forces us to walk it. The question is, how far are you willing to go down that path?" The words hit her like a physical blow, the weight of them sinking deep into her chest. She had thought she was just working for a wealthy man, taking care of his home, keeping things in order, being nothing more than a presence in the background. But now, everything had changed. What happens now? Her voice was barely above a whisper, but Liam heard it. He always heard it. His gaze softened for just a second, and she swore she saw something flicker in his eyes. A flicker of something almost human, but then it was gone, buried beneath the layers of cold calculation and control that he wore like a second skin. "Now," he said, pushing off the wall and taking a slow step closer to her, "you start learning what it means to survive in my world. There are things you'll need to understand, things you'll need to be prepared for. And if you want to stay alive in this game, Elena, you'll have to learn fast." Eleanor didn't speak for a long moment, her mind spinning, processing his words. She wanted to ask what exactly she was being dragged into. She wanted to demand answers, to know what this was, what kind of life she had just agreed to. But even as the questions rushed to her lips, she knew better than to ask them. There was no simple answer. There was no truth she could understand yet. So, what do I need to do? She asked instead, her voice steadier than she felt. Liam's lips twisted into a smile, though it held no warmth. For now, you're going to learn how to be useful to me. You're going to learn how to play this game, Elena. Because if you don't, you'll become a liability. And liabilities, well, they don't last long around here. The coldness of his words made her stomach churn. There was no kindness in his eyes, no compassion, only a ruthless, unyielding resolve. He was a man who had built his life on power, and the cost of that power was the people around him. She wasn't sure whether she was part of his plan or just another tool in his arsenal, but one thing was certain. She was no longer just the maid, and she was already in too deep to back out. Liam turned and walked over to his desk, picking up a folder that was half buried beneath a stack of papers. He opened it slowly, scanning the contents before turning back to her. The file wasn't just a pile of documents. It was a blueprint for something far more dangerous, something she wasn't ready for. Everything you see here, he said, tapping. The file with one finger is part of a larger picture. There are players in this world who want control, and then there are those who take it. I don't wait for things to happen, Elena. I make them happen. His words sent a chill through her. The weight of them hung in the air, thick and suffocating. This wasn't just business. This was power on a scale she couldn't comprehend, and she had walked straight into it, unaware of the consequences. Liam sat down across from her, the sharpness of his gaze never leaving her face. Your first lesson is simple, he said. Observe, listen, watch everything, and trust nothing. There are enemies all around us, Elena, and some of them wear the same face as the people you think you can trust. Eleanor's chest tightened. Enemies? Liam's smile deepened, but it was far from reassuring. Enemies who would do anything to bring me down. Enemies who would have no problem using you against me. He leaned forward slightly, the cold edge of his voice cutting through the silence. You want to survive? Then you need to learn how to protect yourself, how to play this game. Because believe me, it's a game you don't get to walk away from once you're in. Her breath caught in her throat, and she fought the urge to shrink back. She had thought the worst of it was over when she walked into the room. But now, as Liam spoke, she realized the depths of the danger she had just entered. She had no idea what kind of game she had stumbled into, but it was clear now that it was a game where the stakes were life and death. I'll teach you, Liam continued, his voice almost soothing now. But don't mistake that for kindness. I'm not here to protect you. I'm here to make sure you survive. And surviving in my world means doing whatever it takes. Whatever it takes, Eleanor. The weight of his words sank into her bones, heavy and unrelenting. She couldn't run from this. She couldn't escape. She was trapped. And the worst part, she wasn't sure if she wanted to leave. The weight of his words sank into her bones, heavy and unrelenting. She couldn't run from this. She couldn't escape. She was trapped and, the worst part, she wasn't sure if she wanted to leave. Not yet. Not when the truth, dark and all-encompassing, hung between them like a fragile thread, ready to snap. Mai's breath came in shallow, quick bursts, her chest rising and falling as she stood frozen, in the doorway, her wide eyes not leaving Kaito's face. The tension in the room was suffocating, as if the air itself had thickened, refusing to let either of them move. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to undo what had just happened. Everything she had believed, everything she had assumed about her employer, her life here, all of it had just been shattered in one single moment. She was still standing, there, paralyzed, her fingers still resting on the doorknob, caught between the impulse to bolt from the room or to step forward and confront the truth. But something, some invisible force, kept her anchored in place. Kaito's gaze never wavered, his eyes dark but unreadable, as if he was watching her unravel in real time, savoring every moment of her internal struggle. Kaito remained silent for what felt like an eternity. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make her feel like every thought in her mind was being laid bare. She could almost hear the rapid beating of her heart, in her ears, pounding with a rhythm that mirrored the chaos inside her chest. She had to break the silence. She had to say something, anything, to regain control. Her lips parted, but the words wouldn't come. It was like her mind had gone blank, consumed by the raw intensity of the situation. Kaito took a step toward her. Just one. But it was enough to send a shockwave through Mai's already frayed nerves. He moved with purpose, his steps measured, deliberate. For a moment, she thought he might reach out, might touch her, but he didn't. Instead, he stood just inches away from her, his presence towering over her, suffocating her in the silence. Mai swallowed hard, her throat dry. She couldn't help but notice the subtle way the moonlight hit his features, casting shadows across his face that only deepened the mystery of him. She had always thought she knew him. The quiet, composed man who had hired her, who gave her tasks and gave little else in return. But now, standing here in the darkness, she realized how little she truly understood about him. "I never meant for you to see this," Kaito finally spoke, his voice low, the words barely a whisper. But they carried with them an undeniable weight, a weight that seemed to pull Mai deeper into the room, deeper into the tangled web he had inadvertently ensnared her in. The way he said it, the way he acknowledged the moment without trying to justify himself, made something stir within her. There was no anger in his voice, no fear, just a strange calmness, like he had already resigned himself to the consequences. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. This wasn't about him protecting himself. This was about him pulling her into something darker, something that had been hidden away for so long. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to leave. She wanted to run far away from this mess, from him, from the suffocating tension that seemed to cling to the very walls. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't. Something held her there. Something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the curiosity gnawing at her, pulling her deeper into the mystery of Kaito. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, his gaze not accusing, but almost waiting, as if he was daring her to stay. A million questions swirled in her mind, but none of them seemed important enough to ask. The only thing that mattered was the way her body trembled in his presence, the way his mere proximity made her feel as though her heart might explode in her chest. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this way, this close to the edge, this unsure of herself. "I didn't expect you to react like this," Kaito continued, his voice gaining strength. I thought you'd just leave, like everyone else does. But you're still here. And I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing." He was testing her, she realized, testing her resolve. But what was the right answer? Should she leave? Should she confront him, demand the truth, demand an explanation for what she had just seen? She wanted to, but her body didn't move. She couldn't move. Not yet. Not when his words, his presence, held her in place like an invisible chain. "I never wanted you to see me like this," Kaito said, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "But now that you have, I need to know something, Mai. What are you going to do?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time, Mai realized that the choice was hers. She wasn't trapped in this room by force. She was here by choice. And what she did next would determine the course of everything. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything, her thoughts spinning out of control. Kaito was dangerous, she realized, not in a physical sense, but in the way he made her feel. This magnetic pull, this overwhelming desire to stay, to learn more, to understand. Mai took a breath, steadying herself as she finally spoke, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "I don't know what you expect from me, Kaito," she began, the words tasting foreign in her mouth. "But I can't. I can't just walk away from this. Not yet." A flicker of something, satisfaction, maybe, passed across his features. Too quick for her to read. He stepped back, giving her space, but his eyes never left her. They were dark, unreadable, as though he were waiting for her to say something more, something that would tip the scales in one direction or another. "I thought as much," he murmured, the ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're not like the others." Mai didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't like the others, was she? But she didn't know how much of that was true anymore. What had she just stepped into? Was this some kind of trap, or was it something else entirely? "I'm not leaving," Mai whispered, more to herself than to him. "Not yet." Kaito's smile deepened, his eyes narrowing with something that almost resembled approval. "Good," he said, his voice a quiet promise, "because this is only just the beginning." Kaito's words hung in the air like a dark promise, and Mai's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. There was a chill creeping up her spine, an unsettling sensation that she couldn't shake off. The room felt colder now, or maybe it was just her growing unease that was making the walls close in around her. She had never felt more out of her depth. She was standing at the edge of a precipice, staring down into an abyss of uncertainty and temptation. Kaito's gaze was still locked on hers, his dark eyes piercing into her soul as if he could see through every mask she wore. She had spent so long keeping her emotions under control, maintaining the facade of calm professionalism that she prided herself on. But in this moment, all of that felt fragile, ready to crumble at the slightest touch. Kaito tilted his head slightly, studying her with a look that almost bordered on amusement. "You know, Mai, I've always admired your composure. It's one of the reasons I hired you. But now—" He let the sentence trail off, leaving the implication lingering between them like a thread ready to snap. "Now, I'm curious to see how you'll handle this." The words were laced with something darker, something dangerous. Mai could feel the weight of them pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. The way he spoke, so matter-of-factly, as if the situation were already settled in his mind, made her question everything she thought she knew. She had always believed that she could control the situation, that she could navigate this strange dynamic between them without losing herself. But now, standing in the middle of his dimly lit room, she wasn't so sure. She was caught in his web, whether she liked it or not. "What do you want from me, Kaito?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, a raw, unfiltered demand. Her voice shook slightly, betraying the fear and uncertainty she was desperately trying to suppress. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step toward her, the sound of his shoes on the hardwood floor almost deafening in the stillness. Mai's heart raced as she instinctively took a step back, her back pressing against the doorframe. Kaito stopped just short of her, the space between them now charged with a tension that felt palpable. He didn't touch her, but his presence was enough to make her skin crawl, to make every nerve in her body light up with a strange mixture of fear and something else, something she didn't want to acknowledge. "I want to see how far you're willing to go," Kaito said, his voice low, almost a whisper. The words slid into the air between them like poison, leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. "I want to see if you're really as strong as you think you are, or if, deep down, you're just like everyone else, weak, willing to fold under pressure." Mai swallowed hard, her throat dry. His words were a challenge, and she could feel the weight of it, the pressure mounting with every passing second. She had always prided herself on her ability to remain calm, to stay in control. But now, she wasn't sure if she could hold on to that control for much longer. She had stepped into a dangerous game, one that she wasn't sure she could win. But that didn't mean she was going to back down. "I'm not weak," Mai said, her voice firmer than she felt. She wanted to believe it. Wanted to believe that she wasn't like all the others Kaito had dismissed so easily, but the doubt gnawed at her. Kaito's lips curled into a knowing smile, a smile that made her heart skip a beat. He wasn't fooled by her bravado, and somehow, that only made her feel even more exposed. "I know," he replied, his tone still laced with that dark amusement. "But everyone has their breaking point, don't they? Even you." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and it sent a shiver down her spine. Mai's mind raced. What was he trying to do? Push her to the edge, test her limits. But why? What was the endgame here? "I won't break," she said, more to herself than to him, her voice barely a whisper. Kaito's eyes softened just a fraction, but the intensity in them never wavered. "You say that now," he murmured, "but we both know that words are cheap. Actions, they speak louder." A flicker of something, was it sympathy, crossed his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that cold, calculating gaze that made her feel so small. Mai could feel the heat rising in her chest, the pressure of the moment suffocating her. She wanted to shout, to demand answers, to force Kaito to explain what he was really trying to do, what he wanted from her. But the words stuck in her throat, caught somewhere between fear and desire, between the instinct to flee and the strange pull that kept her rooted to the spot. "You're testing me, aren't you?" she finally managed to say, her voice a little steadier now. Kaito didn't answer immediately, just watched her with that unreadable look in his eyes. He took a small step back, as if giving her space, but it only made the air feel heavier. "Maybe," he said, his voice laced with quiet amusement. "Maybe I'm just curious. Curious to see how long it will take before you realize what's really at stake here." She frowned, trying to process his words. At stake? What did he mean? But before she could ask, Kaito moved again. This time, it wasn't toward her, but to the small table near the corner of the room. He picked up a glass of what looked like whiskey, swirling it gently in his hand before taking a slow sip. The action was almost casual, but the tension didn't dissipate. If anything, it only intensified. The room now charged with an almost palpable energy. "You're not like the others," Kaito repeated almost to himself. "And that's why I'm so curious. Why are you still here, Mai, after everything you've seen?" Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her, about why she was still here, why she hadn't run away. She had the chance to leave, to step out of this strange, dangerous game. But she hadn't. She was still standing here, facing him, confronting the questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice quieter now, but still resolute. "But I'm not leaving." Kaito looked at her over the rim of his glass, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, thick and oppressive, like a heavy fog that refused to lift. For a long moment, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. The tension was unbearable, but it was also intoxicating. Mai felt her pulse quicken, her breath shallow, as if every second in this room brought her closer to something she couldn't quite define. Finally, Kaito set the glass down with a soft clink, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're making a mistake, Mai," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But maybe, just maybe, that's what makes this interesting." Kaito's words lingered in the air, curling around her like a thick, invisible fog. Mai could feel them burrowing under her skin, digging deep into the layers of doubt and confusion that had started to surface. A mistake. He was calling her actions a mistake, but what did he mean by that? Did he believe she was going to fold under the pressure? Was he testing her will? Or was it something darker, something deeper than just a challenge? Her breath hitched as she took another step back, the back of her heels brushing against the doorframe. She wanted to escape, to turn and run as far away from this room, from this situation, from Kaito as she could, but that yearning to flee was met with an even stronger pull to stay, to face whatever it was he had planned for her. It was as if her body was caught in a conflict between two forces, one urging her to leave and the other drawing her closer. "I am not afraid of you, Kaito," she said, though her voice was trembling despite her best efforts to sound confident. She didn't want to appear weak. She couldn't afford to show any cracks in her armor. Not now. Kaito's gaze never left hers, and for a moment, she wondered if he was studying her like a specimen under a microscope. Every shift in her expression, every flicker of uncertainty seemed to register in his eyes. It was as if he could see through every defense she had built up, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking, what she was feeling. "You should be," he replied, his voice calm, almost too calm. "Fear is a natural reaction. It's how you survive. But you don't seem to be afraid of much, do you?" His words, calm and measured, carried with them a subtle, yet undeniable power. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. He wasn't threatening her directly, but his words painted a picture of a world in which she was powerless, a world in which he held all the cards. And that realization sent a tremor through her, deep inside her chest, a flicker of panic that she quickly buried. "I'm not afraid of you," Mai repeated, though this time she wasn't so sure. It was as if saying the words could somehow convince herself, that she wasn't vulnerable, that she hadn't been exposed, that she hadn't just stepped into a trap she might never escape. Kaito took a slow step forward, and Mai instinctively took a step back, her breath shallow, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. She couldn't move. She couldn't escape. "You're afraid of something, though, aren't you?" Kaito continued, his voice smooth, almost coaxing, like a soft hand brushing across the surface of her mind, teasing out her deepest fears. "Maybe it's not me you're afraid of. Maybe it's yourself." The words hit her like a slap, and her breath caught in her throat. What did he mean by that? Was he implying that she was the one holding herself back, that she was afraid of her own emotions, of her own desires? The realization was unsettling, and she tried to push it away, but it lingered at the edge of her thoughts like an echo. She wanted to deny it, wanted to lash out, to take control of the situation and assert her dominance once again. But every time she tried to take a step forward, Kaito was always one move ahead of her, always just out of reach. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking, the crack in her composure widening like a fracture in glass. I don't want this." Kaito's expression softened, but it was a softness that felt somehow dangerous. "But you do, Mai. You're standing here, aren't you? You're still here despite everything." He took another step closer, and this time, she didn't retreat. She couldn't. "You can't lie to me, not anymore." She felt his words like a physical weight, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to tell him to stop, to make him understand that she wasn't some puppet for him to manipulate, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood frozen, her body betraying her as she remained rooted to the spot. Kaito was so close now that she could feel the heat of his presence, his proximity almost suffocating. She could smell the faint hint of his cologne, feel the intensity of his gaze as it bore into her. There was no escape from him, not physically, not mentally. She was trapped. Her mind raced, torn between the desire to lash out and the undeniable, pulled toward him, toward the magnetic tension that seemed to grow with each passing second. She didn't understand what it was, but it was there, a flicker of something too dangerous to ignore. Was it the power he held over her? The way he knew exactly how to press her buttons, how to unravel her? Or was it something darker, something more twisted that she couldn't even begin to comprehend? "You think you're in control, don't you?" Kaito's voice was almost a whisper now, but it was still as potent as ever. "But you're not. You've never been. You're just as much a part of this game as everyone else, and it's too late to turn back now." The words sent a shock through her system, and for a moment, it felt as though the ground beneath her was giving way, as if she were falling, spiraling into something she couldn't grasp. She wanted to deny it, to scream at him, to fight back. But the weight of his words held her captive. I don't know what you want from me, she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if the very act of speaking might break the fragile thread that connected her to this moment. Kaito studied her for a long time, his gaze unwavering. What I want, he said slowly, his voice low and deliberate, is for you to stop lying to yourself. You're here because you want to be. You want this, and deep down, you know it. You're just too afraid to admit it. Mai's chest tightened, her pulse racing as if it might burst from her skin. She was shaking now, though she didn't know if it was from fear or something else. Something darker, something more complicated. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The walls felt like they were closing in around her, and for a moment she thought she might lose control, that she might break down right here in front of him. But even in the midst of her panic, she couldn't deny the truth in his words. She was here. She had stayed. She hadn't run. And now there was no turning back. Kaito took another step forward, closing the distance between them until they were standing mere inches apart. She could feel the heat of his body, the tension between them nearly unbearable. "You're mine now, Mai," he said, his voice quiet but laced with finality. "And there's no going back."